Hey children, it's story time once again with your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian. Today, Friday the 13th, Hell Lake, Chapter 1. Now that winter had devoured the fall, the cooling air above Crystal Lake formed a soothing balm. There was little chill in the evaporated water that still fed the early morning dew, even during the wintry prelude to the year to come. There was only the customary stillness of the lake, the water's surface that sometimes rippled with memories, like a distorted mirror of the recent past, every time somebody idly skimmed a stone upon it. In this season of early nightfall, no one could see his or her face reflected out of the water. So opaque with darkness was its still sheen. Voices rang out from the lakeside and deep into the surrounding forest. Friday the 13th of January, 2006, may have seemed a strange time to hold a sophomore party. Students at the University of Forest Green had already started their second year several months previously, and, as comfortable as the cooling New Jersey nights were in this rural county, open-air festivities back in September had run on much later. But it was the first Friday the 13th of the year. There was a tradition to honor, after all. A macabre, but half-joking tradition that very few people still living in Forest Green took seriously these days. If they had, they might have been offended that the college kids felt the date worth marking at all. "Hey, welcome to Lake Blood Party, people!" The master of ceremonies wore a short goatee beard, an open shirt, reverse baseball cap, and the baggiest shorts this side of Limp Bizkit. It was his portable CD system that rocked the elm trees up to the top of their branches. It was also his idea to make tonight's party open to freshmen on their first college semester. If a party that took place under the canopy of the night sky could get any more open than it already was, that is. While the beats boomed out on the banks of the lake, pockets of college kids spread out from its perimeters. Frat boys and girls, jocks and stoners, conformists and misfits, each partied happily in social segregation, with each faction keeping determinedly to themselves. "Gonna kick it to some classic hip-hop now?" Josh Logan always earned more affectionate ribbing than he felt he deserved. But that came from his playing the dancing bear role. Insane Clown Posse were not exactly what most would call classic hip-hop. But then the track that Josh had chosen, The Juggler, booming out at bird's nest-shaking volume, seemed strangely apt for tonight's festivities. "He'll cut your windpipe, eat your face," promised the clown princes of horror rap. Trey LeBlanc smiled and grimaced a little at the same time. He could tolerate Josh, even if, with his clueless wiggedom, most people thought him a fool, and so he was conceited, Trey, but an amiable, well-intentioned fool. Is he going to play some real music, or should we just drink strychnine instead? The soft, pallid face of James Fitzgerald curled its upper lip in disgust. I mean, give me an old-time polka over this mock-rap refuse. James and his equally saturine girlfriend, Lisa Applebaum, did their best to emphasize what they saw as their aloofness, their cultural alienation from the mainstream, which, as far as Trey could see, was all very sincere. It was just that some cynical people refused to take their claims to sophistication seriously, as if an immersion in the romantic culture of old Europe and 19th century literature was somehow at odds with black and purple streaked hair, heavy kohl around the eyes, platform cyber boots, and chunky silver jewelry that shone with the allure of tin. "Yeah," Trey smiled. "He was hounding me to choose some of my favorite rap tracks. I mean, like, rap? Me?" He gave his friends a little time to appreciate the absurdity. "I asked him if he had Christian Death reciting Bald Air over an electronic backing. Threw him a little, methinks." James and Lisa smiled in appreciation. But Trey made himself squirm inside. He knew he was trying to play to the gallery. He could be every bit as pretentious as his pale-faced goth friends at times. "Hey, adolescents, what's down?" Trey knew he couldn't camp it up in front of Shauna. If he gave the vague air of affection, she'd use his plasma for nail polish, and he felt all the better for it. In a strange way, she made him relax. He knew if he tried to impress, tried to be anything other than he was, she would make him feel like a fool. "Joshua is bringing down the walls of Jericho with his sound system." Lisa pouted through her purple lipstick. "He wanted to take our opinion on what the best horror rap tracks are. I mean, like, please, leave us alone and gather your votes from the core constituency." Shauna could share this joke. but it wasn't splitting her sides. She kind of liked James and Lisa, even found them kind of sweetly sexy, though it was little James's goth looks that she kind of went for. It's true that J and L were almost clones of each other, but she really couldn't go for the girl-girl thing. In her opinion, makeup always looked best on men, for whom God had intended it. Well, doesn't that seem kind of appropriate? I mean, given the anniversary that we're all celebrating and everything. Trust her to play fly in the ointment. That was what Trey had always liked about her, and that's what had ultimately pissed him off, too. Shauna Black had very definite ideas about authenticity, about who was pure baloney and who was the real deal. But she could take it too far. If there was any one reason their respective temperatures had cooled way down after the hottest, most passionate 6 months Trey had experienced in his near 19 years of living, it was her insistence that she had a better grasp of his identity than he did. He didn't need her superior condescension when it came to knowing who he was and what he wanted. Just because he was one of the only Afro-American students in this white-bread and Mayo college, it didn't mean he had to play the black man role. Oh, that, James sneered, maybe a little over-defensively. Campfire tales from the 1980s. Isn't it all a little bit icky? I mean, if the story's just the complete pan full of poo I've always thought it was, then it seems lame not to wait for this rave from the grave till Friday the 13th, instead of holding it last Halloween. Lisa seconded that motion. Samhain. That's pronounced like Samhain. It was the old North European pagan name for All Hallows' Eve. Shauna rolled her eyes at Gretchen, the pretty short-haired blonde she always had in tow since she and Trey split. There were a lot of things she could tolerate. Well, maybe not that many. But one thing she definitely could not stand was people acting as if they were several worlds removed from who they really were. But if that story's true, Trey butted in, he could see where this might be heading, and didn't need Shauna's abrasiveness putting a down on everyone's evening. If the story's true, continued James, then what are we celebrating? That on Friday, the 13th of July, 1979, before any of us were born, by the way, a group of people were butchered beyond recognition? That the perpetrators were never caught, but some people tried to join the blame on a crazy lady who was found decapitated? And then in years that follow, and that's of no interest to you, right? Shauna jumped straight back in for the kill again. Trey threw her a mildly reproachful look. But I thought living in the grim, gloomy, bloody past was what your whole thing was about. Oh, but not like that, Lisa protested. Where is the dark romance in someone getting a screwdriver driven through one ear and out the other side? It's hardly from the fevered brow of Poe, or even some hopeless gothic type like Bram Stoker. That earned smiles all around. It was cute to hear Lisa Applebaum with her chubby, heavily made-up face and runic nose piercing call anyone a hopeless gothic type. Still, she pressed her point. It's just thuggery turned up to the max. The story that all those barbarous killings started up again the next year, and it was the woman's retarded son. I don't know the whole story. I doubt it's even true. But what is there in it to appeal to the gothic imagination exactly? I mean, it's not like there's any element of the fantastic or the supernatural. It's folklore. It's modern myth, Trey broke in, sounding like he had devoured all the 25th anniversary analysis in the press and on public radio. People have a need for apocryphal stories. They make sense of aspects of the world that are out of our control. Like the murder rate goes astronomical in the 70s and 80s. So much that people start to invent stories that it's all a handful of misfits doing the same killing. You hear about that fool Henry Lee Lucas? James nodded avidly. For all Lisa's protestations, he wasn't above dipping a toe into the fetid pool of American serial killer lore. Then you know that law enforcement tried to pin murders on him that happened in states hundreds of miles apart on the same day. Lucas's own confessions were so unreliable that when President W. was governor of Texas, he actually gave him a reprieve from death row. All this because one substance-abusing white trash loser wanted to be as famous as Elvis fucking Presley. When the legend becomes fact, we print that legend. Her voice was so seldom heard that for a moment the others didn't recognize who spoke. I mean, it's like this place. There are a whole load of folk stories attached to it. Sometimes people call it Lake Blood, or sometimes it's Hell Lake. But it all comes from the same thing. I mean, The murders at the summer camp, more than a quarter century ago. A few facts merging into legend. Gretchen Andrews started strong, but tailed off in self-consciousness. She just wasn't used to all eyes and ears being on her. It was an inhibition that was already affecting her performance in classes. A creeping self-consciousness that caused her to dry up as a wave of pink embarrassment swept her face. Sounds like it has the ring of truth to me, like I was saying. Trey was man enough to back up the girl's words when she faltered. It sounded to him like she gave her approval to his half-digested theory about modern myth and truth becoming inextricable anyhow. He wasn't about to fall into the trap of showing any hostility to Gretchen. Ever since she found herself on the first semester of the American Cultural Studies class, she'd like to hide in Shauna's shadow. He could understand that. Shauna was a tough girl by nature, and an abrasive bitch only when she really wanted to be. She would make anyone a worthy friend. And Trey hoped he was too gracious an individual to be fazed by the sophomore bullshit that was being spoken about the pair of them. Gretchen's attachment and Shauna's sisterly protectiveness were, he knew, being whispered about as some kind of girl-girl thing by fools who took care to stay out of his earshot. Trey felt like it was below him to even recognize it. He knew Shauna too well, and he didn't see her going down that route. But if she could make people wonder, hell, if she could tantalize him by playing with the mystery of lesbian chic, then that's what she'd do. If James and Lisa were like photo variants on each other, then with Shauna and Trey it had counted for double. Only they didn't have to make such a contrived effort. Even if the two of them were no longer an item these days, then most of their peers still pegged them as a couple. She was long and lithe and 5'10", with a thick eruption of dark brown hair that she shaved at the sides, partly overshadowing her naturally white complexion. Trey was long and lean and 6 feet tall. His highly individualized hairstyle was partly crimped, shaven at the roots and smoothed down into a kind of tufted plateau that stopped just short of being a retro afro. Both of them had a penchant for tightly fitting black clothes, jeans and t-shirts, tunics and work boots that sometimes made Shauna look like she was a picture of Trey in negative. It was she who was the androgynous one in their on-again, off-again relationship. "Okay, ravers, I got cold buds coming up." None of the attendees at the Friday the 13th party had any reason to anticipate the terrors of yesteryear, and truly none did. Not even Shauna and Trey and their little crew, for whom the actuality or otherwise of those sordid events was a debating point, felt that its shadow hung over the here and now. It was about as relevant to their lives as agonizing over the outcome of the Salem witch trials at Halloween. It was all so far away that it couldn't touch them, so totally beside the point. Josh brought up his ice bucket of beers, inviting everyone to dig in and grab one. Ever the well-meaning fool, he had brought his reluctant buddies a good selection, from cans of Budweiser to little bottles of Schlitz, to full 8-ounce bottles of malt liquor, and one was declining his offer. "And I got some pretty cool bud, too." Josh unwrapped a big joint of Cuban cigar proportions. He held it to his nose and made an exaggerated show of appreciating its odor. Then he proffered it to Trey. "You want to get that lit up, my man?" He most certainly did not. Trey didn't want to make a big production of it, but ensured his refusal made Josh feel a little silly. "Nah, man, me not smoke the herbs and thing." Scarcely missing a beat, Josh realized his error of protocol and offered the blunt around. James and Lisa were not so aloof from their peers that they didn't want to get stoned with them. "Isn't that a little gotch for you, getting fucked up on weed?" Shauna asked Lisa with a chuckle, as the little goth took her second big hit and passed it to her eager boyfriend. "No." Her eyes had already narrowed and turned a glassy pink. No one was going to fault Josh Logan for his hospitality tonight. "I want to go back to the 19th century Paris." Her voice was losing its shrill edge. "Back to the days of hashish dens and abstinence. Back to the future, say I." She started to giggle. They were far from the only students whooping it up in the great outdoors that evening. Not all of the many groups spread over nearly 2 acres of public land had members who were using marijuana, or some illicit, botanical-like mushrooms, or even beer. But none of them felt the dead weight of adult expectations on the shoulders that night. No one felt any need to be unduly worried about the hours they had to devote to research, or essay writing, or working as a waitress or a busboy that weekend. The evening was drawing on. As night came down, so the fields around the lake were illuminated by small pockets of artificial light. Kids improvised with circles of battery torches, halogen lamps, or even in one case, a theatrical spotlight secured in the branches of a tree and powered by a small, backpack-sized generator. Seen from the vantage point of the woods, it was as if a festival of lights had brought the region to life that night. Everyone was split into their own peer groups, but no one group was getting in another's face. For most, their semester of solid work had provoked a need to throw off responsibility, and to spend some time doing nothing but being and feeling young. It was a beautiful vibe, while it lasted. "This looks kind of pagan." Lisa's dreamy voice fought for the right words. James had been rendered incapable of speech. On the edges of the forest, the frat boys and girls with the spotlight were setting up a kind of counter-rave against Josh's sound system in the field. They had a boom box that was sounding out loud, to drown out the echo of his cheesy selection of shock rap. At least, that's the way he saw it. "Well, we can't have that now, can we?" he slurred merrily, his mood as light as his footsteps were heavy. He picked up his mobile speakers and turned them towards where most of the crowd had headed, away from the lake and into the shade of the trees, to preserve warmth as the night temperature fell and keep their electrical equipment dry. Then he jacked the sound right up to 10. The beat and the menacing lyrics of another old-school shocker, the Ghetto Boys serial killer, slammed out into the night. Apart from the people who were wasted or just plain jubilant, enough to happily sit in the middle of this sonic warfare, some of the revelers were turned off by the noise, turning it into a cacophony. "Aw, Haley, don't walk out on me like you're pissed. Not in front of my homeboys and all." The homeboy was just a frat boy, as far as Trey could see. Short, mousy hair with the floppy curtain fringe, buffed up for the football field with a B for Beta insignia on his zipper jacket. It felt strange for Trey to hear how black ghetto vernacular had been appropriated by mainstream white society, to the extent where it sometimes no longer meant anything. But then, who was he to feel propriety? He was not of the ghetto, nor did he want to be. "I am not pissed," yelled the girl with some vehemence, trying to be heard above Josh's sound system. "I just don't want to be here when the squad cars turn up. My mom knows the sheriff of Forest Green. He's been trying to get an under-21s curfew passed onto the county legislature, just like everywhere else. All this noise after 9 p.m., I can't believe they're not on their way over here right now." Just the type to get hysterical about Mommy sitting on her shoulder, thought Shauna, frustrated that no one would offer her a lift home to her parents. The demure little blonde princess looked frenziedly around for new targets for her ire. "And that! Look at that!" Josh's face looked as stoned as a sleeping bloodhound's. He got paranoid when she pointed at him, the half-smoked blunt hanging from his mouth on the verge of going out. "That's pot, isn't it?" she asked as accusatorily as a shocked mother in a 1960s soap opera. "Oh, that's just fine. All our asses are thrown in jail on account of a few stupid stoners." Her boyfriend tried to hold her and calm her down as she wiggled free. Along with the potheads, the rest of the group bristled at being made scapegoats for her hysteria. But only Shauna reacted. "Here, give me that, with your lighter." She extended the silver braceleted hand to Josh. He complied slowly. When he passed the blunt around the first time, she declined, regarding it as a little antisocial. If she wanted to get messed up, she'd stay in her room staring at some stupid movie or MTV program. But the little bitch had thrown down the gauntlet. Damn good. She lit the edges of the tobacco leaf, inhaling deep on the hydrophonically grown weed packed within. Took such a deep lungful that she felt her optic nerves twitching as she released it. Its slow stream blew its way straight over to the hysterical frat girl, leaving its pungent taint upon her clothes. "Here, girlfriend." She passed the smoldering butt to Gretchen. "Free your mind before they put your body in prison." The blonde who Shauna was baiting looked like she might turn blue with apoplexy. Her boyfriend seemed as if his ass was tightening with anticipation of her blowing her fuse. But then a howling, whooshing upsurge of air and water split the night. Everyone heard it, but it was those in closest proximity to the lakeside itself, not much more than a few hundred yards away, who were the most startled, the most deafened. Some of the slimy moss was displaced far enough to rain down onto their heads. No one spoke for a moment. Not the clear-headed, who were wondering just what the gag was. Not the stoned, whose reverie was disturbed by the hydrated explosion, making a reality adjustment to check that they were experiencing the same thing as everyone else. But Josh was at least conscious enough to shift the volume control in the sound system right back down to 0. It was then that they heard the little after-reports, the intermittent splashes that seemed to break out every few seconds, along the entire length and breadth of Crystal Lake. They all listened. The youthful cacophony of just a few moments ago replaced by a rapt silence. As much as it had disturbed the evening, it also broke the tension that had been building between Trey's crowd and the frat boy groupings. The uptight blonde's boyfriend and Trey LeBlanc were suddenly amused to find that they were watching each other closely, as if each needed to see the other's reaction to validate his own response. Trey couldn't help but give an embarrassed laugh. It broke the ice. "Hey, you know what I think that shit was?" the clean-cut kid asked with a smile. No, Trey had no idea. "My dad told me the tricks of the trade for today's busy fishermen. If you want to go home with a catch, but you can't afford to spend too much time away from the office, the deal is to go night fishing and prime a river or a lake with depth charges." "What? Are we talking explosives?" Trey couldn't help but be amused by this, bullshit or not. All around them, everyone else's attention was grabbed by the eruptions down at the lake. Some carried torches, their only source of light as the night sky, and the crescent moon hiding behind a passing cloud had turned the water an impenetrable black. Trey and his new frat boy buddy turned tail for the water. What the hell, everyone else was making for the lake, some of them at the water's edge already. "I'm telling you, my friend," the freshman told him, overcompensating for how they were nearly at loggerheads mere moments ago. "I'm betting these are trout waters. I'll lay you even bets there are some dead trout laying on top of the lake when we get down there." The rush turned into a good-natured scramble among every guy there, and some of the girls. "Hey, where are we going?" asked Josh as Trey grabbed his arm and bustled him along. "Why, boy?" Trey answered in his best caricature Afro-American. "We're getting ourselves what we need for a Saturday night fish fry." A what?" Glassy-eyed and laughing, Josh was one step behind the pack. "Ah, you wouldn't know about it," Trey told him. "It's a black thing." Down by the lakeside there wasn't a dead fish in sight. But then, not much could be seen at all, as the dark night at Crystal Lake moved towards the witching hour. All the same, lake watching was the new enthusiasm of every man-boy amongst them. The big source of amusement was that no one really knew what was causing it. Yet everyone had his or her own theory. All of them were blown out of the water, so to speak, every time another small eruption or sudden splash came from a different part of the lake. "What is this, dude? It's like standing outside when you're letting one rip in the bathwater." "Ha! Maybe we got Manitou migrated from down south. I bet they can fart up a storm when they're underwater." So it went on, the sudden splash that broke the water's surface, but erupting from the underside rather than being dropped in, was followed by increasingly more scattered sounds, gurgling, moans, human sounds, that urged people to check on their friends to ensure none had fallen into the lake, or rustling, squelching noises, suggesting some people might be trying to clamber their way onto the bank. It started a popular new game. Which dumbass has fallen in the water? But remained as inexplicable as the big eruption that caused it. "Hey!" the voice called out from the south side of the lake, opposite to where Trey and his friends were hunkered down. "Hey! Someone just came scrambling out of the lake. I called out to them, but they wouldn't stop." "Over here!" The shouted reports were becoming almost as numerous as the eruptions and the noises from the water. "I got a runner!" Excitement multiplied, along with each obscure sighting, as at least a couple of hundred students gravitated around the lake. Their darkened, silhouetted forms were indistinguishable from those that suddenly broke away from the crowd and ran. As Brian Sanders, the clean-cut freshman who had buddied up with the charismatic black dude, reached the water's edge, someone barged into his shoulder as hard as if he was trying to make a football tackle. "Hey, easy, man," he stuttered, spattered with water. "Get the fuck out of my way, kid," the speaker growled, and he was gone, making a break into the night. Brian was momentarily stunned. It wasn't just the bad humor that emanated from the runner, it was the guttural sound of his voice, not coarsened by age, but with an edge more hostile than anyone the boy had encountered in his young life. "Over here, I got one, I guess." Winded and bewildered, the boy pointed the finger at his own personal water rat out of a sense of duty to join in. "I think he's running into the woods." "Who? Let's play Hunt the Wetback." The affirmative cry went up from the conglomerate mass. All the kids seemed to be moving as one now, some leading the pack, others falling back or hanging around the fringes. But none were immune to the excitement or the compulsion to behave as a pack animal. Brian was surprised to find himself being pulled along by Haley, all anxieties about the police forgotten now that they were all engaged in a mighty game of hide-and-seek. Gradually, one large contingent from the assembled throng broke away, leaving their peers to monitor the occasional breaking of the water's surface and the sounds of escape that often followed. Shauna was surprised to find Trey's arm suddenly around her. She looked at him with glassy eyes too mellow not to go with the flow. "Let's all keep together," he told her, as if to explain his sudden affection. "We go into the forest without searchlights. Some of us aren't going to come out again tonight." Trey was actually conscious he was now the only member of their party who had his head on straight. "Okay." She smiled at him, more aloof and distant than ever now. "Let's go look for the mermen with their little fish tails." She removed Trey's arm from around her shoulder, clasping his hand in her right fist as she gripped Gretchen's hand in her left. "All for one and one for all. Let's explore." With little inclination to run with the pack, they walked together as casual observers. Gretchen, cottonmouthed and silent, was happy to stick with her friend. As long as Shauna was with her, she knew she'd feel secure. James and Lisa seemed to have stayed put. Being part of this physical mass would be highly distasteful to them. Shauna reminded herself of this. Or maybe, she pondered, the image drifting unannounced into her brain, they're standing by the lake together, waiting for the moon to reappear so they can watch it reflect on the surface of the water. "They're coming to get you, Barbara." The figure that jumped out on them from the darkness was unmistakable. Even so, Josh's galumphing form still made the girl start. "Buffoon!" Shauna accused, but she couldn't work up any real anger. She just wished that James and Lisa were there, to identify which midnight movie he'd stolen that corny line from, and tell him how lousy his impersonation undoubtedly was. "At your service, ma'am." The big doofus had worked up a head of excitement. With all the bustling activity around them, and the highly potent weed he'd smoked, he was just like a little boy. He ran off, disappearing into the crowd. By the time they arrived at the perimeter of the forest, the girls were too sleepy-eyed, and Trey was feeling too responsible for them to proceed into the woods themselves. He stifled a little resentment at Gretchen's presence. He'd chained his motorcycle up to the trunk of a felled oak nearby, and could have rode him and Shauna straight back to campus if he didn't have a third party to take care of. They stood around with the other revelers on the edge of the woods, some of whom were already deciding this thing was a little out of whack and were drifting away. Then the first scream filled the air. It sent a cold shock down everyone's spine, as if their collective vertebrae had been pricked by an ice-cutting knife. There was no ambiguity about what they had just heard. It was not as loud as the first eruption from the lake, but none of them were looking to their friends to ask what it was. The second scream galvanized them out of their silence. It was not gender-specific. That cry of horror, or of insufferable anguish or physical pain, could have come from any of the guys or the girls if they were suddenly confronted by the absolute certainty of death. It was a very different crowd massed on the edge of the woods now. Many of the co-eds screwed up their faces in distress, while most of the frat guys just looked stunned. Gradually, the realization that the distant shapes moving through the foliage and twining branches were their own peers compelled a few decisive bodies to follow. Trey was already making his move. As the first scream sliced through the air, he'd let Shauna's hand drop. Now he was following the only path that seemed appropriate. Someone needed their help, or was going to get their ass kicked for staging the most blood-curdling hoax imaginable. "Trey, wait up!" Shauna had snapped rudely out of her reverie, like everyone else who was mildly intoxicated. She didn't know whether she wanted to detain her ex-boyfriend or wanted to follow. She just needed to stall him while she considered her options. He looked back at them both with irritation. "Shauna, if you're coming, then come on." Gretchen was on the verge of tears, just wanting it all to go away, or be dealt with by the cops whose presence would have been such an intrusion mere minutes ago. Then came another scream. It rose upward through the air from the bowels of despair. It was definitely Mel. trying to form words, trying to articulate a plea. Incoherent gargling, cut off before it can make its statement, silenced like the terrified cry of a cow in a slaughterhouse. Every young male not stricken by cowardice moved decisively. Trey was among the first, with Shauna close at hand, but Gretchen was paralyzed by fear and indecision. "Shauna!" she managed to implore, just loud enough to be heard. Her girlfriend hovered in her tracks, unsure about leaving her behind. "It's not like we can do anything now. The screaming stopped." "Yeah, screams are so much less scary when they suddenly cut off, right?" Trey dismissed her with mild disgust. He merged into the crowd of young men, now surging into the forest, with Shauna's just one step behind him. The untidy natural layout fragmented them, made them less of a group. Some followed paths that led to dead ends, cursing as they tried to fight their way through or over bracken and bramble. Trey held back, standing amidst a deepening pile of leaves. He concentrated on the distant shapes and flickers he could just about perceive as he stared upward through the bare branches. A torchlight here, a holler there. Eventually, it was only by holding out a muscular arm and making the other guys hang back that they gauged where the voices of the guys who entered the forest earlier were coming from. It still took a few laps of circling their way downhill, twisting ankles in ditches that looked solid but were filled with leaves, before they found where their college mates were congregating. It seemed they had only just got here themselves. Coming to a halt, not with alarm or panic, but with expressions of incredulity that suggested this whole thing was turning into a hoot. As Trey slid his way down to the small corpse, it seemed everything might turn out to be cool after all. "Brian! Hey, Brian! Was that you that made us bust our ass to get down here?" Brian's buddies were calling to their friend and his girl. Set over on the far side of the corpse, the young couple were propped alert and upright on the deceased trunk of a mighty white oak, its bark corrupted by a black fungus that had spread all over. Trey thought he recognized the kid. Brian. That was the little freshman dude who told him about fish after his girlfriend had kicked up a fuss, right? It wasn't even an hour ago since he'd been speaking with the kid, but he could have mistaken the pair of them for someone else now. It was only when they stepped up close to get Brian's side of the story that he realized why. Brian, no basketball league player to begin with, looked shorter, or rather, his girlfriend looked taller. He and Haley were set up stiff on that trunk, like they expected a dissing from their friends, or had a steel rod stuck up their asses. The ribbing and the joshing died as a bunch of forest green guys, his freshman buddies in the first row, found that Brian and Haley were not as they remembered them. They weren't so much sitting there as propped against the thin white and black flecked branches that sprouted high out of the trunk. In fact, Brian looked different. Brian was wearing what looked like a girl's clothing, with dainty little ballet pumps on his feet to cope with the lakeside soil. It might have been comical had it not been so bizarre. Brian refused to look at his buddy's face on. In fact, he and Haley only had eyes for each other. As they sat facing outward, they regarded each other's askance, so awkwardly that their viewpoint would have been at 90-degree angles with their torsos if they were walking down the street. Haley wearing Brian's fraternity jacket, while he was in her young lady's casual clothes. It was only as the guys assembled around the trunk, cautiously, slowly, that they checked Brian's expression, or lack of it. His eyes rolled way back in his head, till all that could be seen were the whites. His tongue distended slightly from his mouth, coated in a thick red like cranberry sauce. It took one of Brian's best buddies to conjure up the balls needed to reach out to Haley's shoulder. She responded quickly to his touch. Her lolling head inclined downward at first, as if she or Brian, or whichever of the couple the body belonged to, was about to crash to the ground. But her head had a center of gravity of its own. First it fell toward her boyfriend, and the thick blood that ran from her small mouth down to her neck gushed a little more. Then it tilted the other way and came unbalanced. Dropping from Brian's shoulders, it revealed the clean cut that tried to marry her hacked windpipe and spinal column with the bloody vacant space on her boyfriend's shoulders. As Haley's head fell into the winter leaves, it was clear they were never going to be a perfect match. The assembled college kids backed off, speechless, some grabbing a deep breath to keep from retching. As they did, the support their cautious fingertips lent the two bodies was withdrawn, and Haley's small, slender shape concertine to the ground from its propped upright position. Her boyfriend's severed head, which had been replaced uneasily on her shoulders, became detached and bounced off the tree trunk. What ensued can only be described as pandemonium. At least 40 or 50 kids had wandered their way into the forest. All of them wanted to find their way out now, quickly. Trey tried to keep his mind on phoning the cops on Gretchen's cell phone, but just like the others, he ran as fast as he could, as fast as staying close to Shauna and the colliding, tumbling bodies in their way allowed him to. Whichever sick puppy had enjoyed playing with Brian and Haley after ending their lives was still in that forest. In a few short minutes, the exodus from the woods at Forest Green took on epic proportions, as a couple score or more frightened kids came sprinting out of the trees and up the grassy banks. At least now, apart from their murdered friends, everyone was present and accounted for. Or so they thought. Deep in the thick of the woods, Josh Logan was still trying to find his way out. He'd been one of the first to enter, in the mad dash of the wetback hunt, but the fun had gone out of it by now. He'd heard that crazy screaming coming from who knew where, and then a whole load more noise as others came running to check out what was going down. Now, Josh heard nothing. He guessed that the others had found out who was kicking up the big noise, and that now the party was dying down. At least, that seemed to be the most palatable explanation he could consider in his paranoid state. It had been a mistake to finish up that big blunt when he was wandering in the woods. At the time, it just seemed like part of the fun. But now he was alone, with just the fading gleam of his torchlight for companionship. It helped him pick his way through the woods, stopped him falling hands down over quite so many roots. But every time he shone into the trees, their gnarled outlines seemed somehow malevolent, their twisted branches rising to the sky like deformed limbs. He was just stoned, that was all. Stoned and lost. He could hear 1,000 little voices in the trees that might have been the squeaking and chirping of nocturnal animals, whistling through the branches as the night air got colder. His mind couldn't place it. His imagination, working overtime, served only to confuse. He could no longer keep track of his own steps, not knowing how many times he had already walked this route before. "Flashes, I get flashes of Jason," he sang to himself, the old Ghetto Boys lyric from Mind of a Lunatic, as it flashed through his mind. He knew it referred to the lunatic killer who was supposed to have made Crystal Lake his hood, what Trey referred to as a folk story or something. But he also got flashes through his mind of scenes of violence. Some big, lumbering dude slashing at a little chick's throat with a blood-stained machete, while he held the throat of some small dude in the other hand and squeezed the life out of him at the same time. Fuck, he didn't know why he should be prey to those kinds of visions at this time, but it was like his state of mind had made him receptive to somebody else's violent feelings. When he got back to campus and straightened his head out, he was going to stop playing gangsta and horror rap, maybe mellow out with some contemporary R&B for a while. Shit. If he was really going to clean his head up, maybe he'd lay off the blunts for a short period too. Then he heard the noise. At first, it made his heart pound even louder, but then the familiarity seeped its way back into his consciousness. He started feeling stupid that he got his head into such a fucking mess over nothing. That was a big-ass old motorcycle revving up, right? Sounded exactly like Trey's new Kawasaki Ninja. He remembered that the dude had shackled up his bike on the edge of the woods, and that it would take him a few minutes to unlock all the chains. Josh couldn't see his way clear, but he knew that he had to be somewhere nearer to finding a way out of here. "Trey! Hey! Hey, Trey! I'm down here in the trees! Hey, Monsieur LeBlanc! This is Josh Logan in the house! Come on, buddy!" There was an almost immediate rustling in the trees, as if somebody had found an opening on the edge of the woods and come rolling straight down through the foliage. "Hey, S.A.!" That certainly wasn't Trey speaking, but whoever it was sounded like a righteous dude anyways. This was where Josh Logan would humble himself enough to act grateful and feel stupid. Josh was surely relieved to greet the guy as he clambered up from the dead leaves and the dirty ground. "Hey, I wondered when the search party was coming. It's kind of dumb, but for a while I lost my way back there." Yeah, I know. You ain't the only one." The dude seemed in a hurry, but Josh didn't mind. He wasn't of a mind to stay all night in the forest either. Josh didn't recognize the guy. He must have been one of the older students. But oh, what a relief to have him there. "Through this way. Come on, follow me, S.A." He obviously had a sense of place and direction that Josh had all but lost. Following him through to the enclosure, bounded by felled logs where man or nature had been trying to clear the forest, Josh wondered if he had passed this clearing a dozen times without finding it. "Yeah, over here, this way, man, come on." He was sure insistent, but who was Josh to complain? He felt almost like this Hispanic-looking dude had saved his life. "I heard my buddy start up a motorcycle out there. Did he send you in here to get me?" Josh collapsed upon a log in a stressed-out, exhausted heap. It was only now he had time to draw breath that he realized how much strain he'd been putting his body under. "Oh, you with the guy on the motorbike, right?" "Sure thing, dude. Big black chrome Japanese mother." Josh was almost loath to move again too soon, but then his Mex buddy seemed to have everything in hand. "Wait here, S.A. I'll go get your friend. We'll take you out of here." "Cool." Josh was still panting like a tired man twice his age. The stress, the weed, and the late hour had taken their toll. "Say, the older guy said it like an afterthought. "You came into the forest to chase wetbacks, right?" "Yeah, well, that's what someone called them. There was something out of whack going on at the lake, like people kept jumping out of the water or something. It was weird." "Uh-huh. Well, I hate that word, wetbacks. I hope that nobody ever calls me a wetback again." He said it in kind of a joking, friendly way before disappearing back off into the trees again. Josh hoped he hadn't taken offense. It didn't mean anything. The guy spoke and acted like as much like an American as he did. But the relief was intoxicating. He let himself lie back across the log and rest his back against the erect trunk of a white elm. Then it happened in a breath. One single, solitary breath. Josh's respiratory system would never get a chance to repeat its normal in-out function. The chain whipped around his throat from behind the tree and pulled tight. Too tight to let him scream. He could only produce a futile groaning sound from deep down in his belly that would never carry on the breeze. By the time he knew he was being garroted by the sharp chain that keeps the components turning inside a motorcycle wheel, it had bitten deep into his throat. It was a messy process, but whoever held the chain had such a tight grip that it had cut straight through his trachea. His windpipe cut in too. Choking on his blood, Josh couldn't call for help. Only the tears that welled suddenly from the corner of each eye attested to his unbearable terror. Some claim that if a blade is able to make a clean enough decapitation, and the body dies instantaneously, then the head may remain conscious for several seconds after leaving it. That's how they would know that Joshua Logan did not die quickly. By the time they found him the next morning, his head and his lower neck were still connected by solitary strips of flesh and gristle, pinned tight against the tree by the motorcycle chain. And this concludes story time for today, children. This has been Friday the 13th, Hell Lake, Chapter 1. I gave y'all a bonus yesterday by dropping the first chapter of A Nightmare on Elm Street Protege early. And since today was actually the day for dropping 2 chapters of Protege, I thought I would do the same thing for the Friday the 13th fans and give you a bonus chapter of Friday the 13th, Hell Lake. I'll still be back tomorrow with 2 more chapters of Friday the 13th, Hell Lake. This was just a little bonus upload for you. Give you something to listen to until tomorrow. Alright, this has been your 80s Slasher Librarian, and I want to say thank you for listening. Please be sure to subscribe if you haven't done so already. Spread that word out there on the internet. Let more people know about this channel. Please take the time to hit that like button. I'd really appreciate it. Drop a comment. I love hearing from you guys. Be sure to click the bell so you always know when new chapters are dropped on these books. And until next time, thanks for listening.